Hey there, AP Hug team. This is Sanchez with a brief review of our Unit 5, which is looking at cultural patterns and processes. And right now we're going to work on Chapter 4, which is making sure you are able to define and, of course, explain some key concepts relating to cultural geography. All right, so some big ideas in your packet, and part of this lecture is going to help you break down that you should be familiar. But let's first start off with what is culture? So cultural geography is defined as the study of people's lifestyle, their creations, and their relationship to the earth and the supernatural. It is a field of human geography that looks at how and why culture is expressed in different ways in different places. It involves the study of both material and non-material aspects of culture. Material components of culture are things that we can actually, of course, touch, again, tangible artifacts, things that are physically left behind, such as clothing or maybe architecture we can observe in the landscape, versus non-material components of culture. They're thought of things like as ideas of people or religion or even laws. All right, then on the screen right now, of course, you should definitely be able to explain the differences between what we call pop and folk culture. So in folk culture, it's limited to a smaller region and a smaller group of people than popular culture. Folk cultures are usually isolated that have a long-lasting cultural traits that have not changed substantially over long periods. So an example in our textbook and our presentations when we did our case study, folk culture would be the Amish. So thinking about how they use horse-drawn carriages in their communities instead of popular culture traits like something using like a car. So folk culture often spreads through relocation diffusion, where the original group actually moves to another location and takes their folk traits with them. Now, make sure you're able to understand the difference between that and pop culture. So pop culture is mass culture that diffuses quite rapidly. Often folk culture either have not been exposed to popular cultures or they have chosen not to adopt pop culture. Popular culture often spreads through expansion diffusion across space and varied cultures. And some people believe the diffusion of pop culture is threatening the local or regional distinctiveness, causing cultural homogeneity or cultural sameness. So of course, always tying back to Starbucks, the spread of Starbucks is argued to be reducing the diversity of local coffee shops throughout the country. The spread of Western media and English language usage, Western foods, I should say. So the McWorld or McDonald's phenomenon takes away from, non-Western cultural distinctiveness. The spread of popular culture is also seen by many to be harming the environment, as many pop culture traits lead to increased consumption of the Earth's limited natural resources and waste production. So landfills, for example, are stockpiled with plastic water bottles, a fad that has, recently developed in replace of actually drinking from the tap water. Now in our culture unit, we can also tie in a discussion of cultural convergence versus cultural divergence. So cultural convergence occurs when two cultures adopt each other's traits and become more alike. On the flip side, cultural divergence occurs when two cultures become increasingly different, often when one group moves away from the territory of one group. So when we look at on the screen right now, one of our key terms, acculturation. Acculturation occurs when two cultures come into contact with one another, and the weaker of the two adopts the traits of the more dominant culture. Versus we also talked about in this unit something called, sometimes acculturation can lead to assimilation. So assimilation occurs when the original traits of the weaker culture are completely replaced by the traits of the more dominant culture. Okay, on the screen right now we're looking at different cultural hearths. So we can identify a few on the screen. So the first one would be the Andean American near the Andes Mountains in South America. And the direction of diffusion of civilization is eastward throughout South America. We can also look at cultural hearths in Mesoamerica, and the diffusion patterns eastern and western into North America. We look at the cultural hearth of West Africa, which diffused throughout Africa, the Nile River Valley throughout Africa and Southwest Asia, Mesopotamia, which throughout Southwest Asia and Europe, Central and East Asia, West Africa. The Indus River Valley throughout Southwest, Central, and East Asia. The Ganges River Valley throughout the South, Southeast, and Southwest Asia. And also the Wei and Han rivers throughout East and Southeast Asia. So basically saying that cultural hearths are areas where innovations of culture begin. This is where we see agriculture, where we see development, where we see government, urbanization, where they actually originated. Cultural hearths are the major sources of human civilization, and ancient cultural hearths are believed to have developed in places with the capacity for innovation, all near sources of water and arable land, which is of course land that's suitable for farming. Often similar innovations are invented in different hearths without even interaction, such when the agricultural innovation occurred in East Asia and in Mesopotamia. This is known as independent innovation. Okay, of course we can also tie in, besides the early hearths, again, something called cultural regions. So a cultural region is an area that shares a large number of cultural traits. So for example, on the screen, North Africa, similarities in language and religion. So this is where, of course, your AP regions and realms comes in handy. So you need to be familiar with the similarities of each of our AP regions as listed by College Board. All right, also part of this unit, you need to be familiar with the term cultural landscape. So sometimes in cultural geography, it's referred to as the built landscape. So the cultural landscape is the physical imprint actually a culture makes on the environment. So this is, as geographers, we can read the cultural landscape. Things like buildings, artwork, and even music are all examples of cultural elements woven into people's cultural landscape. Karl Sauer, a famous 20th century geographer, actually championed the study of cultural landscape. He basically said that wherever human culture exists, a cultural landscape exists as the culture's unique, kind of like, think of it as the fingerprint on their space of the earth. So cultural ecology is actually the study of the human environment interaction and all the results from that interplay. So at the bottom right here, we also have a term when we're talking about the diffusion of culture and even tying it to our discussion of globalization, something called placelessness, which is defined by basically, again, the loss of uniqueness in a cultural landscape. So if we're talking about the diffusion of English, that could result in losing some of those indigenous languages that can influence the cultural landscape. In the bottom corner, talking about McDonald's. Again, if we had McDonald's in every country, every city around the world, it's going to lose that sense of uniqueness of those unique signages or restaurants or dishes that are unique. So pretty much everything kind of turns into the same, which again, you couldn't necessarily spin as a negative consequence of globalization. All right, and of course, what cultural language, cultural diffusion slide would be finished up by talking about the different types of diffusion. So cultural diffusion and spatial diffusion. People's material and non-material cultures and creations spread across time and space, moving to new places and being carried throughout generations. So cultural diffusion is the spread of people's culture across space. So the two types we look as geographers, we have something called expansion diffusion. And in expansion diffusion, the cultural component, or the phenomenon, spreads outward to new places while remaining strong in its original hearth, the place of origin. So for example, Islam spread to its hearth area in Saudi Arabia to other, it spread to other areas around the world and outside the hearth while still remaining strong in Medina and Mecca. There are several forms of expansion diffusion. First one we've reviewed multiple times is something called stimulus expansion diffusion, which actually occurs when the innovative original idea diffuses from the outward hearth, but the original idea is changed. So we keep using the example of McDonald's in terms of, you know, the McVeggie that might be over in India because, again, the cultural taboo of beef. Another example, you know, iced tea diffused from the south, but the southerners made it sweeter to become sweet tea. So the original idea diffused but was adapted to meet the needs of the new adopters. So there's that slight variation. Second type of expansion diffusion is hierarchical expansion, which occurs when the diffusion, innovation, or concept spreads out from a place or person of power, another level of hierarchical pattern. So another fun example of this would be like hip-hop music. Hip-hop music diffused in a hierarchical pattern, spreading from a few large inner cities to other large cities, and then to smaller inner cities, and finally to more suburban and rural places. And the last one on the list is contagious diffusion, which occurs when numerous places and people near the point of origin become adopters or kind of like infected, if we're talking about in the case of diseases. So for an example, effects of contagious expansion diffusion could be shown with the spread of tuberculosis from its port of origin to the people surrounding who happen to live near where it started. Also on this list at the very bottom, besides expansion diffusion, the other type of diffusion you'll need to be familiar with is relocation diffusion. So relocation diffusion is a little easier to remember because it actually requires the movement of the original adopters from their point of origin to the new place. Alright folks, I put the big ideas back on the screen. So in addition to this mini lecture, go ahead and go back through your notes, your geo logbook, and of course your handouts in your geo binder, and make sure you've addressed all the cultural big ideas. Alright, I'll see you back in class.